Before we begin, take a moment to settle into this investigation. The biblical world is wider, older, and far more complex than most imagine, and every chapter we explore helps this channel bring more clarity to stories people think they already know. If you enjoy documentary-style deep dives into ancient texts and archaeology, consider subscribing. It helps us continue producing research-driven content. Now, let us step into a subject scholars often discuss behind closed doors: the hidden structure of Eden. Most people imagine Eden as a peaceful orchard, sunlight filtering through fig leaves, a quiet river, animals grazing without tension, and two solitary people discovering creation, like children wandering through a newly built world. But ancient readers did not see Eden that way. To them, Eden was not merely a garden. It was a sanctuary, a sacred realm, modeled on the heavenly court. When Genesis speaks of Eden, the language echoes the architecture of temples, the rituals of priests, and the throne rooms of ancient Near Eastern kings. And this is where our investigation begins, with the startling realization that the earliest interpreters of Genesis believed Eden was the first temple, a place where divine presence was not symbolic but spatial, structured, and intentionally designed. Archaeologists examining ancient Israelite religion often note that the biblical description of Eden includes features highly unusual for a garden, but entirely normal for a sanctuary. In the ancient world, sacred spaces were arranged according to a pattern: an inner sanctum, a central object representing divine life, guardians positioned at key points of entry, and rivers or channels flowing outward to symbolize life extending from the deity. In First Temple Jerusalem, this arrangement is unmistakable, and when placed next to the Eden narrative, the parallels are almost too strong to ignore. The description of Eden begins not with a tree, but with a place, a garden planted in the east. That phrase, "in the east," was not a casual geographic note. Ancient Israelites oriented their temples eastward, aligning their sacred structures with the rising sun, which, in biblical symbolism, represented God's life-giving order entering the world each morning. Many ancient cultures built temples facing the dawn, believing that light was not merely illumination, but a physical marker of divine presence. So when Genesis says Eden was set in the east, the original audience would have recognized the implication. This was a sacred zone, oriented like a temple, functioning as a meeting point between heaven and earth. The next detail strengthens this interpretation. Genesis presents a river flowing out of Eden, dividing into four mighty rivers. A river beginning within a garden is botanically unusual, but rivers emerging from temples are common in ancient Near Eastern mythology and iconography. Temples, especially divine palaces, were believed to be the source of water that sustained creation. They symbolized cosmic centers where life began. Archaeological discoveries across Mesopotamia show engraved images of life-giving streams flowing from thrones of deities, watering the land around them. When ancient readers encountered the River of Eden, they would not have pictured a natural spring. They would have imagined the outflow of divine life from a holy center. This context changes everything about how we imagine the first moments of human existence. If Eden was a sanctuary, then Adam and Eve were not simply gardeners. They were priestly figures. Their role was to maintain sacred order within a space designed to reflect the majesty of the divine realm. Many scholars point out that the verbs used in Genesis to describe Adam's task, to work and to keep, are the same Hebrew verbs later used to describe the duties of priests in the tabernacle. These were not agricultural words, they were liturgical ones. And so humanity's first assignment was not farming, but stewardship, guardianship of holiness. This raises an intriguing question. Why did Genesis describe such a profound setting with such brevity? Why did it compress what seems to be a vast and symbolic landscape into a few simple lines? The answer lies in the literary culture of the ancient world. Genesis often relies on the audience's familiarity with broader traditions, interpreting them implicitly, rather than restating every detail. Much of the world of Eden was taken for granted by early readers who already knew the stories, symbols, and geography referenced by the text. Today, we do not. We inherit a modern imagination shaped by paintings, children's books, and simplified retellings. But the ancient Israelites lived in a world where sacred geography was part of daily life. They knew that divine presence was associated with mountains, unlike the way later traditions placed Eden low in a valley of greenery. Early Jewish writings, including the Book of Jubilees and various commentaries found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, portray Eden as elevated, a high place, echoing the ancient belief that divine dwellings were always set upon heights. Temples stood on mountains. Gods met mortals on mountains. Visions descended upon mountains. So, when early interpreters placed Eden atop a mountain, they were not adding mythology. They were preserving the cultural context Genesis assumes but does not explicitly spell out. Imagine Eden not as a flat garden, but as a mountain sanctuary, its peak crowned with divine presence, its slopes descending into the lands that Adam and Eve were meant to cultivate and fill. The river that flowed from Eden becomes easier to understand. Rivers begin on mountains. Life spreads outward from the sacred height. This image aligns with an ancient pattern scholars call the cosmic mountain, a structure appearing throughout the biblical world. Ugaritic texts, Babylonian myths, and early Israelite liturgy all share the idea of a divine dwelling atop a mountain where heaven connects with earth. Mount Zion, for example, was portrayed not as a modest elevation, but as the cosmic center from which God ruled. Early Jewish writers extended this symbolism back to Eden. The temple in Jerusalem was seen not merely as a building, but as a reflection of Eden itself, the restored meeting point of God and humanity. This explains details in Genesis that otherwise seem unusual. The cherubim placed at Eden's entrance, often imagined as angels with flaming swords, are drawn from ancient temple guardians, hybrid beings depicted on thrones and gateways across the Levant. These creatures did not guard gardens. They guarded sacred spaces, protecting the access point to the divine throne. Their appearance in Eden confirms that the narrative is architectural, not agricultural. And the tree of life? It functions like the central object of divine presence found in temples, a symbol representing the life of the deity extended to creation. Ancient Near Eastern temples often included a stylized tree or column representing vitality, continuity, and cosmic order. The Israelites adapted this imagery into their own temple design. Scholars widely recognize resonances between the tree of life in Eden and the lampstand, the menorah, in the tabernacle, whose structure resembled a blossoming tree with almond-shaped ornaments. To ancient thinkers, both objects signified the same thing: divine life accessible within a sacred realm. all of this paints a picture of Eden radically different from the one most modern readers imagine. Eden was not simply the beginning of human history. It was the first sacred architecture, the original sanctuary, the prototype for every encounter between God and humanity that followed. But then another question emerges. If Eden was so clearly structured like a temple, why does Genesis describe it in such understated terms, as if recounting events far older than the visual memory of the culture itself? Scholars propose that Genesis may reflect a tradition older than Israelite temple architecture. Perhaps a memory rooted in early Semitic cosmology, preserved within a literary form that compresses vast ideas into tight narrative units. Ancient stories were not always linear. They were symbolic frameworks expressing theology through images, rather than explicit descriptions. Early Jewish commentators filled in these compressed layers. Philo of Alexandria, writing in the 1st century, argued that Eden represented both a real and symbolic geography, a place on earth mirroring a higher heavenly archetype. Rabbinic texts describe Eden in terms consistent with temple liturgy, and early Christian thinkers picked up the same pattern, interpreting Christ's resurrection as the moment humanity was once again offered the possibility of entering the true sanctuary, the restored Eden. In this vast landscape of interpretation, one detail remains striking. Eden was always meant to be a place of relationship, not retreat. The sacred architecture was not designed to keep humanity out, but to draw it near. The divine presence in Eden was accessible, approachable, and relational, until the moment it was not. Genesis describes the meeting of God and humanity in simple terms, walking in the garden in the cool of the day. This phrase has often been dismissed as poetic, but for ancient readers, it pointed to a specific time of temple visitation. Priests performed rituals at dawn and dusk, the moments of changing light when divine order was believed to move through the world. The cool of the day likely refers to the afternoon breeze that descends when sunlight begins to soften, a natural metaphor for God's presence approaching the sanctuary. In this moment, Adam and Eve's relationship with God was not mystical speculation. It was structured, rhythmic, rooted in sacred time. But Eden, as a sanctuary, also contained boundaries, and boundaries demand respect. The presence of two distinct trees at the center of the garden, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, forms the heart of that boundary. And while Part 1 lays the foundation for understanding Eden as a sacred space, later sections will explore how these trees functioned within that architecture, why early interpreters linked them to kingship and divine authority, and how the serpent exploited the symbolic structure of the sanctuary itself. For now, we end Part 1 with a crucial realization. Eden was never meant to be a simple orchard. It was the first temple, a place where heaven touched earth, where humanity lived in the presence of the divine, and where the architecture of relationship was established before the fall ever occurred. When modern readers encounter the description of Eden's geography, they often imagine a literal map, a garden somewhere in the ancient Near East, with 4 rivers flowing from a single source, branching into recognizable waterways. But ancient interpreters never assumed Genesis was describing a simple physical landscape. Instead, they understood Eden as a point where sacred geography, cosmic symbolism, and real-world cultural memory met. To them, the text was not a travel guide. It was a theological map of the world as it was meant to be. Eden's description begins with a detail scholars still discuss today. A single river flows out of the garden and divides into four. Hydrologically, such a claim is unusual. Rivers merge. They do not normally split far downstream into four massive branches that become world-shaping waterways. The ancient Israelites, deeply familiar with their land's geography, knew this as well as any modern geographer. This means the description is symbolic, structured to convey meaning within the worldview of the ancient Near East. The four rivers, named as Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates, anchor Eden to a vast cultural memory. Two of them, the Tigris and Euphrates, were central to Mesopotamian identity. They defined the cradle of civilization, the lands of Assyria and Babylon. The fact that Genesis mentions these rivers does not necessarily indicate that Eden was physically located in Mesopotamia. Instead, it signals that Eden's influence extended into the known world. For ancient readers, these rivers represented the boundaries of human civilization, linking Eden to the spread of life, culture, and divine order. The other two rivers, Pishon and Gihon, are more enigmatic. Scholars have proposed multiple identifications, each reflecting different layers of ancient tradition. Some early Jewish writings associate the Gihon with the Nile, connecting Eden's reach to Africa and the mysterious lands of Cush. Others link the Pishon to regions rich in gold, bdellium, and precious stones, materials associated with royal power and sacred artifact production. These references suggest that the story of Eden incorporated a symbolic map of the ancient world, combining multiple cultural horizons into a single narrative. This merging of geographies tells us something essential about how Genesis functioned in its earliest context. The text was not written to answer the question, "Where is Eden?" Instead, it addressed a deeper question. What is the nature of the world into which humanity was placed? By linking Eden's river to distant lands, the narrative suggests that life's order radiated outward from a sacred center. The world was envisioned as a series of expanding zones, the sanctuary of Eden at the core, the cultivated land surrounding it, and the broader wilderness beyond. A pattern that mirrors ancient temple layouts, where holiness radiated outward in concentric rings. Archaeology sheds further light on this worldview. Ancient Near Eastern cultures often conceptualized the cosmos as a tripartite structure: the divine realm, the sacred land, and the inhabited world. These layers were not merely spatial but symbolic, representing proximity to divine presence. In this framework, Eden corresponds to the divine saturated center, a realm of perfect order from which life flows. The surrounding lands represent humanity's domain, the space given to cultivate and steward. Beyond these lay the wilderness, a region of untamed forces and lingering chaos. The river that flows from Eden symbolizes the transition between these realms, carrying divine blessing into the human world. Understanding the symbolic nature of Eden's geography allows us to revisit its ancient interpretations with clarity. Early Jewish commentators were not concerned with identifying exact locations for Eden's rivers. Instead, they focused on the meaning behind the names and descriptions. The lands of Havilah, Cush, and Assyria, all mentioned in Eden's context, held cultural significance for ancient Israelites. They represented wealth, power, exile, and divine interaction. Including them in the Eden narrative connected the world's earliest moments with the unfolding history of nations. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide further insight. Among the scrolls are texts that reinterpret biblical geography using symbolic patterns consistent with priestly and temple traditions. These writings portray sacred spaces as microcosms of the world, and the world as an extension of sacred architecture. Eden fits seamlessly into this pattern. Its description is not topographical, but cosmological, linking physical locations to theological ideas. The mention of gold and precious stones in the land of Havilah deepens the symbolic landscape. These materials were not ordinary commodities. They were used in the construction of temples, crowns, and ritual objects. In the context of Eden, they evoke a sense of sacred richness, the resources necessary to build a sanctuary. Ancient readers would have recognized this immediately. A garden containing sources of sacred materials was not merely a place of beauty. It was the starting point of a world designed for worship. This connection becomes even clearer when considering the Gihon River, traditionally linked in some Jewish interpretations to the waters surrounding Jerusalem. The city's ancient water system, including the famous Gihon Spring, was central to its identity and survival. Associating Eden's river with Jerusalem reinforced the belief that the temple was a restoration of Eden's sanctity. The water flowing from the temple in prophetic writings mirrors the river flowing from Eden in Genesis, symbolizing renewal and divine life extending into the world. Ancient Mesopotamian traditions offer parallel insights. Temples such as the Ekur of Nippur and the Esagila of Babylon were described as cosmic centers from which life and order radiated. These temples often featured canals or stylized representations of flowing water, symbolizing the deity's power to sustain creation. The imagery of a river dividing into multiple streams aligns with this tradition, suggesting that Eden, too, was a cosmic center, the source of life and order. What emerges from this comparison is a consistent pattern. The ancient world understood sacred spaces in cosmological terms. They were not simply locations, but representations of divine governance. Eden's geography fits this pattern precisely. It is described not in terms of measurable distances, but in terms of influence, symbolism, and sacred extension. Another dimension of Eden's geography appears in early Christian writings, which often speak of Eden as a place higher than the earth, echoing the mountain imagery found in Jewish traditions. If Eden was envisioned as a high place, then the river flowing from it becomes a natural feature. From mountaintops, rivers descend into valleys and plains. This aligns Eden with a broader set of ancient beliefs that divine presence dwelled on elevated ground. Mountains symbolize stability, permanence, and the intersection of heaven and earth. But the symbolic geography of Eden does not end with rivers and mountains. The text also describes boundaries, both explicit and implicit. The eastern entrance to Eden, guarded by cherubim, implies that the garden had borders, thresholds, and designated access points. These features resemble temple layouts more than open landscapes. Temples of the ancient world had controlled entryways, often adorned with guardian figures. The placement of guardians at Eden's entrance reinforces the idea that the garden functioned as a divine sanctuary rather than an unrestricted wilderness. This architectural framework helps explain why Eden's location became a matter of mystery rather than historical record. If the garden was envisioned as a sacred center rather than a geographic spot, its location was inherently symbolic. Its inaccessibility after humanity's exile reflects the loss of immediate divine presence. The guarded entrance signifies a closed sanctuary, not a hidden physical site. To ancient interpreters, searching for Eden's coordinates would have been as nonsensical as trying to pinpoint the location of heaven. The symbolic interpretation does not negate the possibility that Eden reflected real geography known to ancient Israelites. Many scholars suggest that the narrative preserves memory traces of ancient river systems, mountains, and regions passed down through oral tradition. But the purpose of these references was not to anchor Eden in a specific spot. Instead, they serve to depict a world ordered by divine intention, with Eden as its central point of coherence. The interplay between real geography and symbolic meaning becomes clearer when considering the broader cultural context of Genesis. The ancient Near East was a landscape shaped by competing cosmologies. Sumerians, Akkadians, Egyptians, and Canaanites each had their own creation myths and sacred geographies. Genesis presents a uniquely Israelite vision of the world, one in which divine order radiates from a central sanctuary rather than emerging from a cosmic battle or a pantheon's internal struggles. Eden's geography reinforces this peaceful, structured vision of creation. Within this framework, humanity's placement in Eden acquires deeper meaning. Adam and Eve were not placed at random. They were set within the world's sacred center in proximity to divine presence, with the task of extending Eden's order outward. The garden was the origin point of human vocation. Its geography symbolized the structure of that mission. Understanding this context transforms the way we read the rest of the Eden narrative. The fall is no longer simply a moral failure, but a disruption of sacred order. The exile is not merely punishment, but a transition from sacred space to ordinary land. And the locked entrance is not a literal gate, but a symbol of humanity's separation from the divine center. What remains most striking about Eden's geography is the way it blends the concrete with the symbolic. The names of rivers, the mention of precious stones, the description of lands, all reflect real-world elements. But these elements are assembled into a structure that conveys meaning far beyond physical coordinates. Eden becomes a map of the world as it was meant to be, ordered, interconnected, and governed by divine presence. In later parts of this story, the symbolic nature of Eden's geography will help illuminate the meaning of the trees, the role of the serpent, the nature of the exile, and the enduring hope of restoration found in later biblical writings. For now, Eden stands before us as a sacred landscape, not lost, but hidden behind layers of symbolism, history, and interpretation that ancient readers understood intuitively. The geography of Eden was never meant to be found. It was meant to be understood. When Genesis describes the expulsion from Eden, the narrative concludes with a striking image. Cherubim stationed at the eastern boundary, guarding the way to the tree of life. For many modern readers, this detail evokes simple imagery. Winged angels wielding swords of fire. But to ancient Israelites, the word cherubim carried overwhelming visual and theological weight. These were not the gentle figures of Renaissance art or the sentimental guardians of later religious imagination. They were powerful, hybrid beings carved into thrones, positioned at gateways, and associated with the presence of God Himself. Understanding what Genesis intended us to see requires us to step into the world that produced this imagery. a world where temple guardians stood between mortal realms and divine presence, where sacred architecture echoed heavenly realities, and where hybrid creatures symbolized cosmic order. The cherubim of Eden belong to this world, not to later artistic traditions, and their presence at Eden's entrance reveals more about the garden's nature than almost any other detail in the narrative. Ancient Israelites knew cherubim not from speculation, but from direct artistic and cultural memory. The Ark of the Covenant, central to Israel's worship, featured two cherubim with outstretched wings, overshadowing the divine throne. In temple descriptions, cherubim lined the walls, marking the inner sanctum where God's presence dwelled. These figures were not imagined as angels in the modern sense. Instead, they resembled the composite beings depicted in the art of surrounding cultures, part lion, part bull, part eagle, part human, representing strength, sovereignty, vigilance, and transcendence. Similar guardians appear across the ancient Near East. Assyrian palaces featured colossal lamassu, protective beings with the bodies of bulls or lions, wings of eagles, and faces of kings. Egyptian temples displayed sphinxes, hybrid guardians symbolizing royal power and divine protection. Hittite gates bore imagery of winged lions, marking transitions between ordinary space and sacred territory. These creatures were not monsters. They were boundary markers, visual declarations that one was approaching a site where heaven and earth touched. Within this cultural context, the appearance of cherubim at Eden's boundary signals something crucial. Eden was not simply a garden, nor was the exile merely a moral punishment. The cherubim indicate that Adam and Eve were being removed from a sacred realm. The access point to divine presence was sealed by guardians whose role was not to punish, but to protect the sanctity of the space they watched over. Cherubim appear throughout the Hebrew scriptures in moments associated with divine throne imagery. The Psalms describe God as enthroned upon the cherubim, emphasizing his sovereignty and majesty. Prophetic visions, such as those in Ezekiel, depict complex, multi-faced beings accompanying divine movement, images consistent with the temple's throne room symbolism. These depictions are not random. They reflect a well-developed theology of divine kingship, in which cherubim serve as symbols of God's authority and the boundary of his domain. This symbolism helps explain why the cherubim appear in Eden only after the exile. Prior to humanity's disobedience, the boundary between sacred space and human habitation was open. Adam and Eve lived within the divine presence, fulfilling their role as stewards of the sanctuary. Once they violated the sacred boundary by taking from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They could no longer remain within the divine realm, unimpeded. Their exile required the establishment of a new boundary, one guarded by beings who symbolize the presence and authority of God. The flaming sword associated with the cherubim adds another layer of complexity. The Hebrew phrase used to describe this sword is unusual, suggesting motion, rotation, or continuous shifting. This is not a static weapon, but a dynamic symbol of divine judgment and protection. Ancient interpreters viewed the flaming sword not as a literal blade, but as a representation of the divine presence itself, a barrier of holiness that could not be crossed without destruction. The combination of cherubim and fiery boundary creates an image consistent with ancient temple practices, where only authorized individuals could enter sacred space and only after purification. To understand the role of cherubim more clearly, we must also consider their placement in Eden, the eastern entrance. In ancient architecture, temples often faced east, aligning with the rising sun. Entranceways to sacred courts typically opened toward the east, symbolizing the movement from ordinary life into the realm of divine order. When Adam and Eve are expelled toward the east and cherubim guard the eastern side, the narrative employs architectural language familiar to ancient audiences. Exile is not only a movement away from God, but a relocation into a space outside the sacred orientation. This Eastern symbolism continues in later biblical tradition. The tabernacle and the temple both faced east, requiring priests to enter through eastern gates. When the prophet Ezekiel describes the return of God's glory to the future temple, it enters through the eastern gate, restoring the sacred orientation lost in Eden. These connections suggest that Eden's narrative informed Israel's understanding of how sacred space should be structured. Temples were built as microcosms of Eden, and cherubim served as reminders of the boundary between the human world and the divine presence. Ancient Jewish literature expands on this theme, though not by adding new creatures or mythological details. Instead, early interpreters emphasize the symbolic meaning of cherubim. Some writings describe them as beings of fire, reflecting the purity and holiness required to approach God. Others depict them as guardians of knowledge, protecting access to divine mysteries. These interpretations are consistent with their role in Eden, not as warriors, but as protectors of sacred order. The presence of cherubim at Eden's entrance raises an important question. What exactly were they guarding? The narrative states that they guarded the way to the tree of life, not the tree itself. This distinction suggests that the tree of life remained in Eden, accessible only through the guarded entrance. The guardians did not surround the tree. They stood at the boundary of the sacred realm, ensuring that humanity could not re-enter without divine permission. This reinforces the idea that Eden was a sanctuary with a designated entrance, not an open landscape. The role of cherubim also helps clarify the nature of humanity's exile. Adam and Eve were not barred from a literal orchard, but from a sacred dimension of existence. Their expulsion represents a shift from a world suffused with divine presence to one where God is encountered through mediated means, through altars, covenants, prophets, and eventually through sanctuaries and temples. The cherubim stand as symbols of this new reality. Proximity to God now required structure, hierarchy, and sanctity. Archaeological discoveries further illuminate the cultural background of cherubim imagery. Excavations at ancient Levantine sites reveal statues and reliefs of winged lions and composite creatures marking temple thresholds. These guardians were not mere decoration. They conveyed a message to all who approached. The space beyond this point was not ordinary. It was under divine protection. Anyone entering without authorization risked death. In this sense, the cherubim at Eden function as the ultimate threshold guardians, positioned not to punish, but to preserve the holiness of the space behind them. Within the broader narrative of Genesis, the cherubim serve as a bridge between Eden and the development of sacred institutions in Israel. When the tabernacle was constructed in the wilderness, cherubim were woven into the fabric of its curtains, carved into the ark, and placed in the innermost sanctuary. These artistic depictions were not meant to remind the Israelites of mythological creatures, but to anchor their worship in the memory of Eden. Every time the high priest entered the Holy of Holies, he stood between images of cherubim, symbolically returning to Eden for a moment, representing the people before the presence of God. This connection is further reinforced in prophetic literature, where visions of God often include cherubim, emphasizing his throne's majesty and the cosmic order that surrounds him. The book of Ezekiel provides the most elaborate depiction, describing beings with 4 faces, human, lion, ox, and eagle, embodying the fullness of creation. These images are often misunderstood as entirely separate beings from the cherubim of Genesis, but the symbolic function is the same. These are boundary figures associated with divine presence, conveying that God's realm transcends human categories. In this context, the cherubim of Eden represent a fundamental shift in the human condition. Before the exile, humanity had unrestricted access to the divine presence. After the exile, that access was mediated, guarded, and conditional. The presence of cherubim at the boundary symbolizes this transition. It marks the beginning of a story that continues throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, the tension between divine holiness and human frailty, between longing for God and the barriers that sin creates. The imagery of cherubim guarding sacred space also foreshadows the structure of later religious life. In Israel's worship, the high priest alone could enter the Holy of Holies, and only once a year after rigorous purification. This ritual reflected the reality that sacred space was not open to all. Access to God required holiness, mediation, and sacrifice. The cherubim carved into the ark reminded the people that divine presence was both near and inaccessible, a paradox rooted in the Eden narrative. Another significant aspect of cherubim is their association with divine mobility. In ancient iconography, such beings often accompany royal thrones, symbolizing the power and authority of the king. When biblical texts describe God as riding upon or dwelling between cherubim, they echo this imagery. The cherubim signify not only boundary, but rulership, the divine sovereignty that governs creation. In Eden, their role as guardians affirms that the space behind them is under God's rule. The meaning of cherubim becomes even more profound when we consider the narrative structure of Genesis. The exile from Eden marks the end of the primordial harmony between God and humanity. The cherubim mark the place where that harmony once existed and where it might someday be restored. In later biblical literature, visions of restoration often include imagery reminiscent of Eden, rivers flowing from the temple, trees with healing fruit, and renewed access to divine presence. The cherubim, once guardians of exclusion, become symbols of hope that the boundary will one day be lifted. Some early Christian writers interpreted the cherubim not only as guardians, but as symbols of the gospel's fourfold witness, or the attributes of Christ. While these interpretations go beyond the original context, they reflect a continuity of thought. The cherubim represent the fullness of God's presence, the unity of creation, and the hope of restoration. These layers of meaning, though developed later, underscore the foundational role cherubim played from the earliest biblical narratives. What is most striking about the cherubim of Eden is the way they embody the story's tension. They stand between humanity and the divine, reflecting both judgment and mercy. Their presence signals the consequences of disobedience, yet their role as guardians implies that the tree of life and the possibility of restored relationship remains preserved. The boundary is closed, but not destroyed. The way is guarded, but not erased. The story does not end in abandonment, but in anticipation. In understanding the cherubim, we gain insight into the nature of Eden itself. The garden was not a place of naive innocence, but a sacred realm, structured by divine order. Its boundaries were real, its holiness tangible, and its guardians formidable. When humanity stepped outside that order, the guardians appeared, not as enforcers of wrath, but as protectors of sanctity. The presence of cherubim at Eden's entrance marks the beginning of humanity's journey through a world where access to God is mediated through symbols, covenants, and sacred institutions. Their imagery echoes through the tabernacle, the temple, the prophets, and the visions of restoration found in later writings. The guardians of Eden stand not only at the boundary of the first sanctuary, but at the threshold of biblical history itself. In the next section of this investigation, the symbolism surrounding the Tree of Life will reveal even more about the nature of Eden as a sacred space and the divine intention behind humanity's earliest vocation. When Genesis introduces the Tree of Life, it does so with almost startling brevity. The narrative places the tree in the midst of the garden, yet says almost nothing else about it until the moment humanity is banished. This silence has puzzled readers for centuries, but in the ancient world, the mere mention of a life-giving tree positioned at the center of a sacred realm carried immense symbolic weight. To early Israelites and their neighbors, a central tree was not a botanical detail. It was an architectural feature, a symbol found in temples, coronation rituals, and mythic iconography across the Near East. Understanding the Tree of Life requires understanding how ancient cultures conceptualized sacred space. The heart of a sanctuary was always defined by a central object representing divine presence, blessing, or authority. In Mesopotamian temples, stylized trees stood beside thrones, symbolizing fertility, cosmic order, and the continuity of kingship. In Egyptian iconography, sacred trees grew in the courts of the gods, with their fruit representing knowledge bestowed upon chosen rulers. In Canaanite reliefs, the goddess Asherah was often associated with a symbolic tree or wooden pole, representing life and divine favor. Although Israel rejected the worship associated with these objects, Israelites were still aware of this broader symbolic tradition. They understood what a sacred tree meant within the cultural world that shaped their literary imagination. Against this backdrop, the Tree of Life in Eden becomes something far greater than a mythic plant. It is the focal point of the sanctuary, the symbol of divine presence at the very center of creation. Its placement in the midst of the garden mirrors the placement of sacred objects in later Israelite temples. Specifically, the menorah, a golden lampstand shaped like a blossoming tree, positioned near the Holy of Holies. Scholars have long noted that the menorah's design, with its branches, buds, and almond-shaped ornaments, resembles a stylized tree. It is not an accident that this object stood beside the space where God's presence dwelled. It represented divine life, just as the Tree of Life did in Eden. This connection becomes clearer when examining ancient Jewish interpretations. Texts preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls often draw explicit parallels between Eden and the temple, and between the Tree of Life and sacred objects within its inner chambers. Early Jewish theologians understood that Genesis described a cosmic sanctuary, and in this context the tree of life functioned as a tangible symbol of divine vitality. Yet the narrative treats the tree of life almost mysteriously. It is there, but overshadowed by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This, too, is consistent with ancient temple symbolism. Sacred objects were rarely described in detail. Their power was assumed. Their meaning was conveyed through ritual, not explanation. The writers of Genesis, drawing from a shared cultural memory, did not need to elaborate on what the tree of life was. Their audience already understood its role within a sacred landscape. The significance of the tree of life becomes even more apparent when we consider its function. The narrative implies that eating from this tree would grant life, not mere survival, but access to divine vitality. Ancient interpreters viewed this not as magical immortality, but as participation in the life of God. Adam and Eve were created mortal, yet placed in proximity to a source of ongoing life. Their role was not to seize it, but to live faithfully within the divine order, receiving life as a gift rather than as an entitlement. This understanding aligns with ancient Near Eastern concepts of kingship. In many cultures, rulers received life from the gods as an ongoing blessing rather than an inherent trait. Their longevity was tied to their fidelity and righteousness. Some scholars argue that Adam, as the first human, was portrayed as a royal figure, not a king in the political sense, but a representative of humanity endowed with responsibility for creation. The tree of life, therefore, functioned as a sign of divine favor and the possibility of eternal communion with God. The structure of Eden reinforces this interpretation. The garden's central area contained both the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This pairing is not accidental. It reflects a tension between divine life and divine authority, between receiving life from God and attempting to claim authority for oneself. Ancient interpreters saw the two trees as representing distinct aspects of human existence: life, which God offers, and discernment, which remains His prerogative. By placing both trees in the center of Eden, the narrative sets up a symbolic drama between trust and autonomy. The role of the tree of life becomes especially clear when considering what happens after the fall. The narrative emphasizes that humanity must not eat from it after gaining knowledge of good and evil. This is not a punishment, but a protective action. In ancient thought, access to divine life required alignment with divine order. Having broken that order, humanity could no longer receive life without distortion. The cherubim were placed at the entrance to guard the way to the tree of life, indicating that access to divine life was preserved, not destroyed, but restricted until the right conditions were restored. This restriction reveals a crucial dimension of the tree of life. It is not just a symbol of life, but a symbol of ordered life, life within the bounds of sacred structure. Humanity's exile from Eden did not eliminate the tree. It simply placed access to it under divine protection. This parallels later temple practices where access to the most sacred objects was limited to specific individuals under specific conditions. Nobody could simply approach and take. Access required holiness, obedience, and mediation. In this light, the tree of life emerges as a precursor to the divine presence that dwelled in the innermost sanctuary of the temple. The high priest, entering once a year, symbolically restored the connection between humanity and God. A brief, ritualized encounter with the life humanity once possessed in Eden. The lavish decorations of the temple, filled with carved trees, flowers, fruits, and cherubim, were deliberate reminders of Eden. They represented the world as it once was, and as it would one day be again. But beyond temple symbolism, the tree of life shaped the way ancient Israelites understood wisdom. In wisdom literature, especially in writings such as Proverbs, wisdom itself is likened to a tree of life. This metaphor does not imply that wisdom and the tree are identical. Instead, it suggests that the tree symbolizes something broader, the life-giving presence of God expressed through his instruction. To embrace wisdom was to participate in divine life. This interpretation reflects the ancient belief that sacred knowledge and sacred life were intertwined. Another dimension of the tree's symbolism appears in early Jewish eschatology. Their vision of the world to come. Texts such as 1 Enoch describe the tree of life reappearing in the future age, its fruit given to the righteous as a sign of restored relationship with God. These interpretations do not modify the Genesis narrative, but expand upon its implications. If access to the tree was lost through disobedience, then access would be restored through divine redemption. The tree becomes a symbol of both loss and hope, a representation of humanity's exile and its ultimate restoration. The tree of life also functions as a counterpoint to the serpent. In ancient iconography, serpents were often associated with wisdom, renewal, and sometimes healing, but they were also associated with chaos and subversion. The serpent's appearance near the two central trees suggests a challenge to divine order. While the tree of life represents life received, the serpent tempts humanity to seize autonomy. This tension sets the stage for the fall, a conflict between dependence upon God and the desire for self-governance. Understanding the tree of life through this lens reshapes the narrative's meaning. The tree is not a prize withheld by God. It is a gift reserved for those living in harmony with divine order. Humanity's disobedience did not prompt God to hide life out of jealousy, but to protect humanity from the consequences of possessing life without alignment. Eternal life disconnected from divine order would be a distortion of creation, not its fulfillment. The architectural symbolism of the tree of life extends even further when we examine parallels from the broader ancient world. In Mesopotamian art, kings are often depicted receiving life from a stylized tree flanked by divine beings. In these depictions, the tree represents the cosmic center, the axis connecting heaven and earth. The tree of life in Eden serves a similar function. It stands at the center of the garden, marking the place where divine presence is most fully manifest. This idea of a cosmic center reappears in later biblical literature. Prophets such as Ezekiel describe rivers flowing from the temple, nourishing the land and restoring life. These rivers echo the river flowing from Eden. Their source, the restored sanctuary, parallels the tree of life, which served as the focal point of Eden's life-giving power. The connection between Eden and the eschatological temple shows that the narrative is not about a lost paradise, but about a sacred structure that will one day be rebuilt. The tree of life also plays a crucial role in understanding humanity's purpose in Eden. Adam and Eve were placed in the garden not merely to enjoy its beauty, but to steward it. Their task involved maintaining the sacred order represented by the tree. By living in obedience, they cultivated a world where divine life could flow freely. Their disobedience disrupted this order, prompting their removal from the sacred realm. But the tree remained, a silent witness to humanity's lost vocation. Later, Jewish literature often connects the tree of life with divine wisdom, law, and covenant. This connection does not replace the tree's literal dimension, but enhances its symbolic richness. The Torah, seen as a source of life for the community, functions as a metaphorical tree of life. Through obedience and righteousness, people participate in the divine life symbolized by the tree. This interpretation aligns with the broader theme that divine life is granted through relationship, not possession. In this context, the tree of life becomes a blueprint for understanding the entire biblical narrative. It represents the life God intended for humanity, life rooted in communion, obedience, and sacred order. Its placement at the center of Eden reflects the centrality of divine presence within creation. Its guarded status after the fall reflects the consequences of breaking sacred boundaries, and its reappearance in visions of restoration reflects the hope that humanity's access to divine life will one day be restored. The tree of life also helps explain why Genesis depicts Eden as a sanctuary rather than a typical earthly location. The tree's central placement corresponds to the innermost chamber of the temple, the place where God's presence dwells. Access to this space requires holiness. The exile represents the loss of this access, while later, covenants and rituals represent attempts to restore it in limited forms. The tree, therefore, becomes a symbol of the entire biblical drama: creation, fall, exile, covenant, and restoration. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the tree of life is its enduring message. Divine life is not something humanity can seize. It must be received. This truth resonates across cultures and eras, shaping the way ancient Israelites understood their relationship with God. The tree stands as a reminder that life flows from the divine center outward. When humanity aligns itself with that order, life flourishes. When it does not, life becomes fractured. As the narrative continues, the presence of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil will further illuminate this theme, revealing the contrast between divine generosity and human ambition. But the tree of life remains the foundation of Eden's sacred architecture, the symbol of a world ordered around divine presence, untouched by decay and designed for communion. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is arguably one of the most misunderstood elements in the entire biblical story. For centuries, commentators, artists, and preachers have imagined this tree as a kind of mystical source of moral insight, as though its fruit contained ethical awareness in edible form. But ancient Jewish interpreters and scholars of the ancient Near East understood something far more nuanced. The tree did not symbolize moral categories in the modern sense. It represented authority, discernment, and the right to define order, capacities linked not to human development, but to divine governance. To grasp this meaning, we need to examine how the phrase knowledge of good and evil functioned in the ancient world. In Hebrew, this expression appears in contexts involving kings, judges, and individuals entrusted with great responsibility. It describes the ability to make binding judgments, to administer justice, and to govern wisely. In other words, it is the language of rulership, not innocence or guilt. This helps explain why the tree stood at the center of Eden, directly beside the tree of life. The pairing is intentional. The two trees represent two aspects of divine reality: life and authority. Life could be received, but authority remained God's alone. Humanity was meant to participate in divine life, but not to seize divine prerogatives. To attempt to take both would be to confuse roles within creation, a confusion the narrative depicts as the root of human downfall. Ancient interpreters recognize this distinction. Early Jewish writings treat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as a symbol of boundaries, not because knowledge itself was forbidden, but because the kind of knowledge represented by the tree belonged to God. To know good and evil in the ancient sense was to determine the structure of reality. It was to become an arbiter of meaning. This level of discernment was associated with kingship and divine authority. In the ancient world, gods were the ones who defined the categories of existence. Humans were not. This understanding aligns with broader Near Eastern concepts of wisdom and sovereignty. In Mesopotamian tradition, divine assembly councils determined justice, order, and the fate of nations. Only the gods possessed the authority to rule. Humans, even kings, received wisdom from the gods, but never claimed the right to shape cosmic order themselves. When Genesis places a tree symbolizing divine authority in the center of Eden, it is participating in this larger discourse. God alone defines the structure of the world. The narrative reinforces this point through its portrayal of the serpent. The serpent challenges not the existence of God, but the boundaries established by him. Its temptation does not involve rebellion against God's presence. It involves crossing a boundary of authority. You will be like God, the serpent claims, knowing good and evil. This is not a promise of moral awareness. It is a promise of independence, of self-governance, of becoming one's own arbiter of reality. The implications of this are profound. The temptation in Eden is not about curiosity. It is about autonomy. It is about the human desire to define meaning, identity, and purpose apart from the structure God provided. It is about taking for oneself what was not given, claiming a prerogative that belongs to the divine realm. Understanding this helps explain why eating from the tree triggers such a dramatic shift in the narrative. After consuming the fruit, Adam and Eve do not suddenly possess encyclopedic knowledge. Instead, their eyes are opened and they experience shame, fear, and alienation. These emotions are not punishments. They are consequences of stepping outside the divine order. By attempting to assume authority, they disrupt the harmony of the sacred realm. Their newfound awareness is not true divine discernment, but a fractured perception shaped by disobedience. They do not become like God. They become self-conscious, vulnerable, and estranged from the meaning-giving center of creation. The ancient world viewed such a transformation as the natural result of violating sacred boundaries. When order was disrupted, chaos entered. When proper roles were overturned, relationships fractured. This is precisely what occurs in Eden. The disobedience of Adam and Eve introduces relational, moral, and cosmic disorder, not because the fruit contained magical properties, but because seizing divine authority destabilized the harmony that sustained the sacred world. The consequences of this action are expressed through the divine questions that follow. Where are you? Who told you? What have you done? These questions resemble the structure of ancient legal proceedings, where violations of sacred order required examination. The narrative mirrors the pattern of a judicial inquiry, not to condemn, but to reveal the truth of what occurred. Ancient law codes often describe judicial processes as discernment between good and evil. This linguistic connection reinforces the idea that the tree symbolizes judgment, a role God performs perfectly, but humans cannot. By attempting to take this role upon themselves, Adam and Eve entered a domain they were not prepared to inhabit. Their attempt to claim divine authority reflected a profound misunderstanding of their place within creation. This theme resonates throughout the rest of Scripture. Later, biblical narratives frequently depict humanity's attempts to seize authority or determine good and evil on their own terms as sources of conflict and suffering. The story of the Tower of Babel, for example, reflects the human desire to centralize power and create a self-defined order. Israel's demand for a king echoes a similar tension. The desire to possess authority without fully submitting to divine rule. Throughout the biblical story, discernment remains a gift given by God, not a right seized by humanity. Another aspect of the tree's symbolism is its relationship to innocence. Contrary to popular belief, innocence in the ancient world did not mean ignorance. It meant living in harmony with divine order. Before eating from the tree, Adam and Eve lived in a state of equilibrium, not naivety. Their nakedness represented openness, vulnerability, and alignment with the sacred structure of creation. After eating, they experienced alienation, not because they gained knowledge, but because they stepped into a realm they were not designed to govern. Some ancient Jewish commentators emphasized that the command not to eat from the tree was not arbitrary. It was a training boundary, a place where humanity learned that life with God required trust. In this reading, the command served a pedagogical purpose. It taught humanity that freedom existed within structure. The tree symbolized the one area where divine authority remained distinct. Respecting that boundary affirmed the relationship between humanity and God. The serpent's temptation exploited this dynamic. The serpent is portrayed as crafty, a term associated with cunning, insight, and manipulation. Early interpreters understood the serpent not as an embodiment of evil, but as a creature that challenged order. Its role in the narrative is to test whether humanity will accept or resist the boundaries of creation. The serpent invites Adam and Eve to view the divine command through the lens of suspicion, to believe that God is withholding something essential. This reframing turns the command from a symbol of relational trust into a symbol of restriction. This shift in perception reflects a broader theme in ancient narratives, the fragility of trust between divine and human realms. Many ancient myths include stories of humans attempting to seize immortality or power, only to face catastrophic consequences. In Mesopotamian literature, heroes like Gilgamesh seek eternal life, but fail because they misunderstand the nature of divine gifts. These stories illustrate a shared cultural theme. Humans flourish when aligned with divine structure and falter when they attempt to transcend it. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil fits within this pattern. It embodies the tension between freedom and boundaries, between autonomy and dependence, between wisdom and presumption. The narrative does not portray God as forbidding knowledge. Instead, it portrays God as establishing the proper context for wisdom. True discernment comes from walking with God, not from grasping authority independently. This interpretation becomes clearer when we consider how later Jewish and Christian writers understood the tree. Early Jewish texts often describe the command associated with the tree as a covenant, not a test, but a relationship-defining boundary. Some writings portray Adam as a kind of primordial priest whose role was to guard the sacred sanctuary. Eating from the tree violated that role, just as a priest violating sacred ritual would face severe consequences. Early Christian thinkers, drawing from Jewish traditions, similarly saw the tree as representing divine commandments, the structure through which humanity maintains relationship with God. Their interpretation emphasizes that true freedom is found not in rejecting divine boundaries, but in embracing them. The significance of the tree also emerges in the way the narrative describes the consequences of disobedience. After eating, Adam and Eve hide from the divine presence, indicating that their perception has fundamentally changed. God's presence, which once brought joy, now brings fear. This shift reflects the internal disruption caused by claiming authority that was not theirs. Their attempt to define reality apart from God resulted in confusion, guilt, and fragmentation. This fragmentation extends into their relationships. Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the serpent. The unity of the sacred realm collapses into discord. The harmony that characterized Eden dissipates. This is not imposed from outside. It arises from within, from the innate consequences of disrupting divine order. The exile that follows is often seen as punitive, but ancient interpreters emphasize that it is also protective. Humanity cannot remain in the sacred realm while carrying the burden of disordered authority. Access to the tree of life must be restricted until relationship and order are restored. The cherubim and the fiery boundary are therefore not obstacles to grace, but symbols of mercy, preserving the sacred order until the time when humanity can once again dwell in alignment with God. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, when understood in this context, becomes one of the most theologically rich symbols in the ancient world. It represents the boundary between divine and human roles. It symbolizes the tension between trust and autonomy. It reveals the nature of wisdom, not as something seized, but as something given. It places humanity within a sacred structure, where life and discernment are gifts governed by relationship. This symbolism shapes the rest of Scripture. Throughout the biblical narrative, the central question is whether humanity will align itself with divine wisdom, or attempt to define good and evil independently. Prophets call people back to wisdom. Kings are judged by their adherence to divine authority. The story of Israel reflects the struggle between dependence on God and reliance on human power. In this ongoing drama, Eden serves as the prototype. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil marks the place where humanity first misunderstood the nature of freedom. The consequences of that misunderstanding echo through history, shaping the human experience of alienation, longing, and the search for meaning. Yet, the story also contains hope. The tree remains within Eden, guarded but not destroyed. The path to wisdom remains open, not through autonomy, but through restored relationship. Later, biblical visions speak of a future in which humanity is once again granted access to divine life, where wisdom flows freely and where the boundaries broken in Eden are healed. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil thus stands at the center of the biblical story, not as a symbol of prohibition, but as a symbol of the sacred order God established and the hope that it will one day be restored. When modern readers encounter the serpent in Eden, they often interpret it through later religious tradition as the devil in disguise, a cosmic adversary lurking in the garden from the very beginning. But the earliest layers of the biblical text present a far more nuanced picture. In the ancient world of the Near East, serpents were not automatically associated with evil. They occupied a broad symbolic range, representing wisdom, danger, renewal, healing, and chaos. To understand the serpent in Genesis, we must step into that world and recover the symbolic vocabulary that informed ancient Israel's imagination. In its earliest appearance, the serpent is described simply as crafty, a term that conveys cleverness, insight, and skillful manipulation. The word does not inherently carry a negative connotation. It is used elsewhere to describe prudence and strategic thinking. But within the context of Eden, it signals a creature capable of reframing reality, of shifting perceptions, of challenging the boundaries established by God. This quality makes the serpent a complex figure, not a monster, but a destabilizer. The serpent's presence in the garden raises a question often overlooked. Why was such a creature allowed within the sacred realm? The answer lies in the ancient understanding of sacred space and the broader narrative structure of Genesis. Eden, as a sanctuary, was a place where divine order prevailed, but the presence of a testing figure, a being capable of challenging boundaries, was not foreign to ancient thought. In Mesopotamian and Canaanite mythology, divine gardens often included guardians, tricksters, or challengers who tested the resolve of divine or human figures. These beings were not necessarily evil, but served a narrative function. They revealed character, exposed intentions, and clarified boundaries. Within this framework, the serpent in Eden functions as a boundary tester. It does not confront God directly. Instead, it probes the integrity of humanity's relationship to divine authority. It questions the nature of the command, reframes God's words, and appeals to the human desire for autonomy. Its role is psychological rather than confrontational. Its threat is subtle rather than violent. The serpent's ability to speak is often viewed as evidence of supernatural identity, but ancient readers would not have been troubled by this detail. Myths and narratives from the ancient Near East frequently depict animals speaking, acting, or interacting with divine figures. This literary device allowed the storytellers to convey meaning without violating their audience's expectations. The serpent's speech indicates that this creature occupies a symbolic role, not that it is a literal talking snake in the modern sense. To understand the serpent's symbolic significance, we must examine how serpents functioned in ancient iconography. Across the Near East, serpents appeared in temple art, royal symbolism, and mythic imagination. In Egypt, serpents symbolized both protection and chaos. The uraeus, the rearing cobra, adorned the crown of Pharaoh, representing sovereignty and divine authority. At the same time, the serpentine creature Apophis embodied chaos, threatening the order of the cosmos. This duality, wisdom and chaos, is central to understanding the serpent in Genesis. In Mesopotamia, serpents were associated with divination, healing, and spiritual insight. The god Ningish-Zida, often depicted with serpents rising from his shoulders, represented wisdom and the transition between realms. The serpent dragon Tiamat symbolized primordial chaos subdued by the god Marduk. The presence of serpents in sacred literature, therefore, conveyed both the lure of wisdom and the danger of disorder. For the Israelites, serpents carried similar ambivalence. Moses' staff transformed into a serpent before Pharaoh, symbolizing divine authority. The bronze serpent in the wilderness, crafted at God's command, represented healing. Yet serpents also symbolize danger, death, and rebellion. This duality reflects the serpent's role in Eden, a creature capable of offering insight, but also capable of leading humanity into disorder. The serpent's question, "Did God really say?" is subtle but profound. It introduces doubt, not by contradicting God's words, but by reframing them. This rhetorical strategy mirrors ancient wisdom traditions, where the path to error often began not with overt disobedience, but with distorted perception. In this sense, the serpent embodies the psychological dimension of temptation, the ability to shift focus from trust to suspicion, from relational meaning to self-centered evaluation. The conversation between Eve and the serpent is structured like a philosophical dispute rather than a confrontation. The serpent appeals to the desire for knowledge, autonomy, and transcendence. It suggests that God's prohibition is an act of withholding rather than protection. This reframing aligns with ancient narratives in which humans attempted to overstep divine boundaries, often with tragic results. The serpent's promise, "You will be like God, knowing good and evil," is the core of its temptation. As explored in the previous part, the phrase, "knowing good and evil," refers not to moral enlightenment, but to the authority to define reality. The serpent does not tempt humanity with wisdom, but with sovereignty. It suggests that the boundary between God and humanity is artificial, that divine authority can be seized rather than received. This interpretation aligns with the ancient understanding of serpents as figures associated with boundary crossing. In many mythological traditions, serpents inhabit liminal spaces between life and death, between earth and underworld, between wisdom and chaos. Their ability to shed skin symbolized renewal, suggesting insight or transformation. But their unpredictable nature also made them symbols of danger. The serpent in Eden embodies this liminality, hovering between insight and disorder. Ancient Jewish interpreters recognized this complexity. Some early writings depict the serpent as a creature intended to serve humanity, whose rebellion introduced disorder. Others portray it as an embodiment of external temptation. Yet, none of these early interpretations equate the serpent with the cosmic adversary found in later religious tradition. That association emerges gradually in Second Temple literature, where the serpent becomes linked to the figure known as the adversary, an accuser or tester in divine assemblies. This shift reflects evolving theological concerns, not the original meaning of the Eden narrative. In the earliest layers of biblical thought, the serpent represents an aspect of creation that challenges human boundaries, not an enemy of God, but a destabilizer of human obedience. Its role is functional rather than metaphysical. It exposes the human inclination to redefine divine structure according to personal desire. This understanding helps explain the aftermath of the serpent's deception. When Adam and Eve eat from the tree, their eyes are opened, but the knowledge they gain is not divine insight. It is self-awareness, an abrupt recognition of vulnerability, exposure, and dislocation. Their new awareness highlights their misalignment with divine order. They cover themselves not out of modesty, but out of fear and alienation. They hide from God not because he has changed, but because they have. The serpent's role becomes clearer in the divine pronouncement. that follows. God addresses the serpent with language that blends judgment with symbolism. The serpent is cursed to crawl on its belly and eat dust, imagery associated with humiliation and defeat. In ancient iconography, serpents represented creatures that rose up, coiled, or struck swiftly. To be forced to crawl symbolized the loss of status and power. Eating dust was a metaphor for subjugation. The curse does not transform the serpent into a literal crawling animal. It symbolizes the reduction of chaos and cunning to a state of weakness. The pronouncement of enmity between the serpent and humanity introduces another symbolic layer. In ancient Near Eastern literature, conflicts between humans and serpents often represented the struggle between order and chaos. The Eden narrative echoes this theme. The serpent's disruption of divine order results in ongoing conflict, not merely between humans and snakes, but between humanity and the forces of disorder represented by the serpent. This conflict takes on a theological dimension in later biblical writings. The serpent becomes a symbol for any force that disrupts human flourishing, challenges divine authority, or distorts wisdom. Prophets and sages warn against paths of folly, comparing them to serpents' deceptive ways. The Psalms describe wicked individuals using serpentine language to mislead others. The imagery extends beyond a literal creature to encompass broader spiritual realities. As Jewish thought developed, the serpent became increasingly associated with the adversarial figure known as the accuser. This figure appears in early texts as a member of the divine council who challenges or tests human faithfulness. Over time, the serpent's role in Eden became linked to this figure, creating the foundation for later interpretations that merged the serpent with a cosmic enemy. This fusion reflects a theological evolution rather than the original worldview of Genesis. The serpent's transformation across centuries illustrates how sacred symbols evolve. What begins as a boundary tester becomes a representation of spiritual opposition. This shift does not contradict the original narrative, but expands its implications in response to new historical and cultural contexts. Ancient Israelites, facing exile, suffering, or oppression, found in the serpent a symbol of the forces that threatened divine order in their own lives. Early Christians saw in the serpent a symbol of spiritual adversaries defeated through divine intervention. The symbol remained dynamic, adapting to the needs of each generation. Returning to the Eden narrative, the serpent's presence reveals an important truth about the nature of creation. The sacred realm of Eden was not a world without complexity or choice. It was a world in which loyalty, trust, and relationship could be tested. The presence of the serpent allowed for the possibility of disobedience, not because God desired failure, but because genuine relationship requires freedom. The serpent's role as a tester underscores the relational nature of divine order. Another dimension of the serpent's symbolism lies in its association with wisdom. In many cultures, serpents represented insight, secret knowledge, and hidden truths. This symbolism is not entirely absent from the Hebrew Scriptures. The bronze serpent in the wilderness becomes a symbol of healing when the Israelites look upon it. The staff of Moses, transformed into a serpent, becomes a sign of divine authority. These examples show that serpents could symbolize both danger and deliverance. The serpent in Eden exploits this ambivalence, presenting itself as a source of insight while leading humanity into disorder. Ancient interpreters often saw the serpent's deception as a distortion of wisdom, a counterfeit insight that mimicked divine truth but lacked divine alignment. This resonates with later wisdom literature, which distinguishes between true wisdom rooted in reverence for God and false wisdom rooted in self-seeking ambition. The serpent's promise resembles the latter, an invitation to bypass relationship in pursuit of autonomy. The serpent's dialogue with Eve underscores the subtlety of temptation. It begins with a question, not a command. It appeals to desire, not rebellion. It offers a partial truth, not an outright lie. In ancient thought, this method of deception was considered the most dangerous. By blending truth with distortion, the serpent leads humanity to misinterpret the nature of divine boundaries. This narrative highlights the fragility of human trust and the ease with which perception can be shaped by external influence. The aftermath of the serpent's deception reveals its true nature. By leading humanity into disobedience, it introduces discord, alienation, and fear into the sacred realm. Its role as a destabilizer becomes clear. It does not overthrow God's order, but disrupts humanity's ability to dwell within it. The serpent's presence exposes the limits of human discernment when separated from divine guidance. This theme resonates throughout the biblical story. When humanity attempts to define order apart from God, the result is fragmentation. When individuals pursue wisdom without humility, the result is confusion. The serpent embodies these dynamics: temptation rooted in autonomy, wisdom divorced from relationship, insight disconnected from reverence. The serpent's place in Eden thus reveals an essential aspect of the biblical worldview. Creation contains possibilities for both harmony and disruption. Humans are called to cultivate order, resist chaos, and align themselves with divine wisdom. The serpent represents the challenge inherent in that calling, the presence of voices, internal and external, that distort truth and blur boundaries. As the narrative moves forward, the serpent fades from the scene. Its role completed, it becomes a symbol rather than a character. The focus shifts to humanity's exile, the consequences of disobedience, and the unfolding story of divine restoration. Yet the serpent's influence lingers. Throughout Scripture, the struggle between order and chaos, wisdom and deception, continues. The serpent becomes a metaphor for this tension, reminding readers that the boundaries established in Eden were not arbitrary but essential to human flourishing. In this light, the serpent stands not as a mythic villain, but as a symbol of the complexity of creation. Its presence in Eden reveals that trust, obedience, and discernment were always at the heart of humanity's relationship with God. The serpent's role underscores the fragility of that relationship and the enduring need for humility in the face of wisdom. The narrative of Eden is not merely a story of temptation and fall. It is a story of boundaries, relationships, and the intricate interplay between life, authority, wisdom, and chaos. The serpent, with its ancient symbolism and multifaceted identity, embodies the tension that lies at the center of this story, a tension that continues to shape the human experience. When the narrative of Eden reaches the moment of disobedience, the tone of Genesis shifts noticeably. Before the eating of the fruit, the story unfolds with simplicity. Descriptions of the garden, the formation of humanity, the naming of animals, the boundaries set by God. But after the serpent's deception and the shared act of disobedience, the narrative transforms into something strikingly formal. It resembles not myth, but legal procedure, an ordered framework in which questions, testimony, examination, and sentencing occur in sequence. For ancient readers, this structure would have been instantly recognizable. It mirrors the judicial patterns of the Near East, where legal disputes were resolved not through physical confrontation, but through carefully staged inquiry. This courtroom structure is one of the least understood aspects of the Eden story. Many modern readers imagine God appearing in the garden out of disappointment or anger. But ancient interpreters saw something more subtle. The Creator conducting an inquiry, following a recognizable pattern of justice that reflects divine order rather than impulsive reaction. This structure frames the fall not as a simple moral failure, but as a legal breach of sacred commandments, a disruption of cosmic order requiring divine adjudication. The first element of this pattern appears in the divine question, "Where are you?" This is not a request for information. In the ancient world, questions posed by authority figures served to initiate proceedings. When judges called defendants to appear, the opening statement was often a formal query, meant to summon, not to inquire. Ancient Akkadian trial texts, for example, begin with questions that establish the presence of the accused. By asking, "Where are you?" God initiates the judicial moment. He is not searching for Adam, he is summoning him. Adam's response introduces the second stage, the admission of the condition. When Adam answers, he does not confess the act directly. Instead, he describes the consequences. "I was afraid. I was naked. I hid." In the language of ancient proceedings, this resembles a declaration of status, an acknowledgement of the changed relationship between the accused and the authority. The fear and hiding reflect awareness of guilt, and ancient readers would have recognized this as part of a legal ritual in which the accused acknowledges that something has ruptured the previous order. God's next question, "Who told you?" is the third stage, examination of evidence. This is not curiosity, but formal judicial structure. In ancient law codes, the judge asked questions that narrowed down responsibility, determined whether the accused acted independently or under influence, and established the chain of events. In this moment, the divine voice leads Adam toward his responsibility, creating a space where the truth can be revealed through dialogue rather than force. Adam's answer reveals a common legal pattern, deflection. He says, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me." This response mirrors a structure found across ancient Near Eastern judicial texts, in which defendants shift blame toward others or even toward the divine. In several ancient myths and legal inscriptions, individuals argue that the God who created them or destined their circumstances shares responsibility. Adam's response follows this cultural pattern exactly. He does not deny the act. He reframes responsibility. His answer becomes part of the testimony, showing how disobedience has fractured relational trust, both between humans and God. The divine inquiry then turns to Eve. "What is this you have done?" This is the fourth stage, direct questioning of the second witness. In ancient trials, when an action involved multiple participants, the judge examined each party separately. Each participant's testimony revealed the layers of intention, influence, and agency. Eve's response, "The serpent deceived me," also mirrors the structure of legal defense. She admits the action, but attributes it to deception, invoking the concept of misleading counsel, a category recognized in ancient law codes such as those of Hammurabi and the Hittites. Deception did not remove responsibility, but it contextualized it. The serpent is not questioned. This detail reflects another judicial norm. In ancient law, animals or symbolic figures involved in wrongdoing were not examined. Instead, they were judged based on the testimony of humans. The serpent's silence is not an oversight. It is part of the ancient legal framework that Genesis employs to structure the narrative. What follows are the pronouncements often called curses, but ancient interpreters recognize them as sentences, judicial declarations that restructure relationships in the aftermath of wrongdoing. The phrasing used resembles ancient pronouncement formulas found in judicial inscriptions. These declarations do not merely punish. They reorder reality to reflect the consequences of the breach. The serpent's sentence is pronounced first. In ancient legal procedure, judgment often began with the instigator before moving to those who followed. The serpent is condemned to crawl on its belly, a symbolic depiction of humiliation. In ancient imagery, creatures that slithered on the ground were associated with defeat. The phrase eating dust is not zoological description, but metaphor for subjugation. Kings humiliated their enemies by forcing them into the dust. The serpent's sentence reflects this cultural symbolism. It is placed in a posture of perpetual defeat. The second dimension of the serpent's sentence involves enmity between its offspring and the offspring of the woman. This is not merely zoological tension, but a symbolic projection of the ongoing conflict between humanity and forces of disorder. Ancient readers understood the serpent as a symbol, and this pronouncement established a long-term struggle between order and chaos, a conflict that would shape human history. The sentence linguistic structure mirrors ancient covenant curses, where enmity and strife were used to signal broken relationship between parties. Eve's sentence follows. The pronouncement regarding difficulty in childbirth is not a curse in the modern sense. It reflects the disruption of harmony that once characterized human existence. In ancient cosmology, childbirth symbolized continuity and blessing. Increased difficulty represents the intrusion of pain into what was once a sacred act. The second part, the tension between desire and relational dynamics, reflects another form of fractured harmony. Ancient interpreters understood this as the breakdown of equilibrium between man and woman, a disruption of mutual cooperation. The judicial language here establishes not punishment, but consequence, the relational imbalance that emerges when divine order is abandoned. Adam's sentence is the most elaborate. It involves the land, the very domain he was tasked to steward. In ancient thought, land was not a neutral resource. It was a partner in human flourishing. Its productivity reflected divine favor. When Adam is told that the ground will resist him, the narrative depicts the disruption of the human vocation. What was once harmonious labor becomes toil. This echoes ancient agricultural curses found in Near Eastern treaties, where land hostility symbolized broken covenant. Adam's relationship with the land is no longer marked by effortless stewardship, but by struggle, reflecting the disharmony introduced by disobedience. The final pronouncement, that humanity will return to dust, reinforces a theme deeply embedded in ancient anthropology. Humans were made from the earth, sustained by divine breath, and destined to return to the earth when separated from divine presence. The judicial structure is clear. Life without harmony with God results in mortality's reign. This does not impose death. It acknowledges the consequence of severed connection to the divine center of life. The entire pronouncement sequence follows a symmetrical structure known in ancient legal documents as case evaluation, identifying the instigator, assessing the participants, and announcing consequences that restore cosmic balance. Even the order of sentences, serpent, woman, man, reflects the narrative chain of action, temptation, response, shared participation. After the pronouncements, the narrative includes a detail often overlooked, but crucial in ancient interpretation. God makes garments of skins for Adam and Eve. In modern readings, this is seen as an act of compassion. In ancient legal symbolism, it represents provision for exile. When individuals were banished from sacred territory, historical records show that judges or rulers sometimes gave them provisions to survive outside the protected space. The garments are not merely clothing. They symbolize divine care even amid judgment, reinforcing that exile is not abandonment, but transformation of relationship. The next movement in the narrative is the divine deliberation. Behold, the human has become like one of us, to know good and evil. This sentence echoes the legal conclusion of a case. It establishes the new status of humanity, no longer aligned with divine order, but possessing a distorted version of authority they cannot sustain. The statement acknowledges irreversible consequences of human choice. Having attempted to seize divine prerogative, humanity now exists in a condition requiring separation from the sacred realm. This leads to the final legal act, banishment. Ancient legal codes prescribe banishment for violations that disrupt sacred order or threaten the stability of a community. Banishment was not always permanent. Sometimes it protected sacred spaces or prevented further harm. The exile from Eden mirrors these patterns. It removes humanity from the sacred domain, placing them in a world where divine presence exists but is no longer directly accessible. The installation of cherubim at the eastern boundary completes the legal sequence. This act resembles the establishment of guards or protective boundaries around sacred spaces in ancient temples. The cherubim are not punitive figures, but enforcers of sacred separation. Their presence marks the cosmic line between the realm of divine presence and the world of human struggle. What emerges from this judicial reading is a picture of Eden's fall very different from modern imagination. The story is not about impulsive wrath. It is about restoration of order after a breach. The divine inquiry is not emotional outburst, but structured justice. The sentences are not vengeful, but integrative. They reestablish boundaries, roles, and consequences consistent with the new reality humanity has chosen. This judicial structure also reveals the narrative's theological depth. The story of Eden is not only about the beginning of sin, it is about the beginning of law, covenant, and the relational patterns that will govern the rest of Scripture. The structure of Eden's trial foreshadows the structure of Israel's covenant at Sinai, where laws define boundaries and blessings depend on alignment with divine order. It foreshadows prophetic judgments, where breaches of covenant result in exile, yet always with the possibility of restoration. The Eden trial also establishes a key pattern in biblical thought. Human disobedience leads to alienation, but divine justice always includes provision, hope, and continuity. Even in exile, humanity remains under God's care. Even outside Eden, the possibility of restored relationship is preserved. The tree of life is guarded, not destroyed. The sacred realm is closed, not erased. In this light, the Eden narrative becomes the foundational expression of how divine justice operates in the biblical worldview. It is not arbitrary, emotional, or destructive. It is orderly, relational, and restorative. It defines consequences not merely to punish, but to preserve the integrity of the sacred world. This ancient legal pattern reshapes our understanding of the fall. The narrative is not about a broken rule, but about a broken relationship. The trial is not about blame, but about truth. The sentences are not about wrath, but about alignment with reality. Exile is not the end, but the beginning of humanity's journey toward restoration. In later parts, the impact of exile will expand as humanity enters a world characterized by wilderness, struggle, and the lingering echoes of chaos. But the trial in Eden remains the blueprint for understanding divine justice throughout the biblical story. When Adam and Eve step beyond the boundary of Eden, the text records a transition so brief that it is easy to overlook its magnitude. One moment, they are within the sacred center of creation, walking in the ordered realm sustained by divine presence. The next, they find themselves outside, in a world no longer structured around immediate communion with God. For ancient readers, this movement carried immense symbolic meaning. Exile was not just relocation. It was a ritual act, a formal transition from sacred status to ordinary existence, from protected domain to unmanaged land, from divine orientation to human uncertainty. Understanding the exile from Eden requires examining ancient Near Eastern practices surrounding expulsion, practices which shaped the imagination of Israel and influenced how biblical authors structured narratives of departure from sacred spaces. In those cultures, expulsion was a highly organized ritual, not an improvised reaction. When someone violated the sanctity of a temple or disrupted the order of a community, they were ceremonially removed to restore balance. The process involved symbolic actions, spoken declarations, boundaries marked by guardians, and the redefinition of status. Every one of these elements appears in the Eden narrative. The first feature of ancient expulsions was separation from sacred geography. Temples and sanctuaries were considered microcosms of the divine order. To remain within those spaces required alignment with their sanctity. When individuals violated that order, they were removed to protect the sacred center. This is exactly the pattern in Eden. Adam and Eve's disobedience disrupted the harmony between humanity and divine presence. Their continued presence within the garden would have been incongruent with the sacred structure God had established. Exile restored that structure. The ancient world used specific symbols to express the transition from sacred presence to ordinary space. Chief among them was the boundary, a marked line between what was holy and what was not. In temples, this boundary was often guarded by statues, carved creatures, or priests. In Eden, the cherubim and the fiery boundary fulfilled this role perfectly. Their presence indicates that the garden remains sacred even after humanity's departure. The space is not abandoned, it is secured. This distinction is crucial. In many myths of the ancient Near East, when a god is offended, the sacred space collapses or is destroyed. But in Genesis, Eden remains intact. The sanctuary is preserved. The tree of life still stands. The boundary is enforced, not eroded. This preserves the hope of restoration, a theme that will echo throughout the entire biblical narrative. Ancient expulsion rituals often included verbal declarations pronouncing the new status of the expelled party. Genesis includes this through the divine sentences addressed to Adam, Eve, and the serpent. These declarations are not mere punishments. They define the new relationship between humanity and the world outside the sacred center. Adam's toil, Eve's difficulty in childbirth, the serpent's humiliation, all establish the environment in which humanity will now live. The pronouncements function as covenantal redefinitions, shaping the human condition in a world no longer aligned with Eden's perfection. Another key element of expulsion rituals was the granting of provisions. While this may seem counterintuitive, ancient kings and judges often ensured that those sent into exile had clothing, food, or tools to survive. This prevented unnecessary death and reflected the ruler's continued authority and responsibility. Genesis mirrors this practice when God provides garments for Adam and Eve. The making of the garments, described with deliberate detail, symbolizes divine compassion even in the context of judgment. It demonstrates that exile does not sever the relationship entirely. Humanity leaves the garden not naked and abandoned, but clothed by the very one whose presence they can no longer directly enter. The landscape outside the garden holds its own symbolic weight. In the ancient imagination, the world beyond sacred boundaries was often portrayed as wilderness, not in the modern sense of natural beauty, but as a region of untamed forces. Wilderness represented unpredictability, danger, and the lingering remnants of primordial chaos. It was where human beings confronted the fragility of life. The narrative does not explicitly name the land outside Eden as wilderness, but the themes are clear. The ground resists cultivation. Labor becomes burdensome. Humanity must learn to survive without immediate access to divine life. This environment reflects the consequences of disrupting sacred harmony. The movement from garden to wilderness parallels patterns found in later biblical stories. Israel's own exile from the land follows similar themes. The exile from Jerusalem is not simply political displacement. It is removal from a sacred geography that defined Israel's identity. In both cases, exile results from breached covenant, and restoration requires renewed alignment with divine order. The Eden narrative provides the archetype for this pattern. Adam and Eve's departure from the garden sets in motion the recurring biblical theme of displacement and return. Ancient expulsion rituals also emphasized loss of vocation. In Eden, humanity's role was priestly, to guard, tend, and cultivate the sacred realm. Outside the garden, that vocation changes dramatically. Instead of stewarding a perfect environment, humanity now wrestles with resistant soil. Instead of enjoying the uninterrupted presence of God, humanity must seek Him amid distance and fragmentation. This shift reveals the depth of what was lost in the fall, not merely ease or immortality, but purpose rooted directly in divine presence. Yet the exile also marks the beginning of something new. In ancient narratives, expulsion sometimes served as preparation, a painful transition that enabled maturity, growth, or transformation. The Hebrew Scriptures reflect this pattern repeatedly. The patriarchs faced displacement and growth through travel. Israel matures through wilderness wandering. Prophets interpret exile as a refining process. In this light, the exile from Eden is not merely tragedy. It is the starting point of humanity's journey toward wisdom, reconciliation, and eventual restoration. The placement of the cherubim at the eastern boundary is a detail rich with significance. In ancient temples, entranceways commonly faced east, symbolizing orientation toward divine order. To exit through the east meant moving away from divine presence. This directional symbolism appears repeatedly in the Hebrew Scriptures. When Cain departs after his own transgression, he journeys eastward. When humanity builds the city of Babel, the text notes that they migrated east. When Lot separates from Abraham, he moves eastward toward the Jordan Plain, a region later associated with moral corruption. These eastward movements all reflect a trajectory away from sacred presence, a pattern that originates in Eden. The fiery boundary associated with the cherubim serves as both protection and warning. The Hebrew phrasing suggests movement, a shaking, turning, or rotating flame. This mirrors descriptions in ancient rituals where fire represented divine holiness or presence. Fire marked the boundary between what was sacred and what was profane. It purified, protected, and illuminated. In Eden, the fiery boundary accomplishes all three. It prevents unauthorized re-entry, signifies the holiness of the space behind it, and ensures that the sacred realm remains uncontaminated by human disorder. The exile also introduces a new dynamic in human existence, mediated access to God. In Eden, humanity encountered divine presence directly. After exile, relationship requires mediation through altars, sacrifices, prophets, and covenants. This mediation reflects the new distance created by disobedience. The narrative does not portray God as withdrawing completely. Instead, he adjusts the mode of interaction to align with humanity's altered condition. The exile initiates the long history of divine-human engagement that unfolds across the rest of Scripture. One of the most striking aspects of the exile is its restraint. In many ancient myths, divine judgment wipes out or transforms the offenders. But in Genesis, the judgment is measured. Humanity is removed from the sacred center, but remains alive. The world is not destroyed. The promise of life continues. This pattern of divine restraint aligns with ancient covenantal frameworks, where the goal of judgment is restoration, not annihilation. The Eden narrative preserves the sacred geography itself. The garden is not destroyed. It becomes hidden, protected, inaccessible, but intact. Early Jewish interpreters emphasized this detail, arguing that Eden still existed in a suspended state, shielded from human reach, yet open to future revelation. Some traditions envisioned Eden as elevated beyond ordinary geography, or as a realm that intersected with divine presence. These interpretations reflect the text's ambiguity. Eden is removed from human experience but not erased from reality. This preservation underscores the central theme of the Eden story. Exile does not eliminate the possibility of return. The guarded path to the tree of life remains. The structure of sacred order persists behind the boundary. The divine presence is not withdrawn, but made inaccessible until humanity can exist in alignment with it once more. This theme becomes central to the eschatological visions of later prophets. They speak of rivers flowing from restored sanctuaries, trees bearing healing fruit, and renewed access to divine life, imagery clearly echoing Eden's geography and the tree of life. The emotional dimension of exile is implied rather than described. The text is spare in its language, but ancient readers would have understood the weight of expulsion. In a culture where land, home, and sacred space defined identity, removal from the center of creation represented profound dislocation. Adam and Eve step into a world where death, toil, and conflict define the rhythm of life. But their exile is not devoid of hope. The narrative includes the first hint of future redemption, the promise that the offspring of the woman will bruise the serpent's head. This promise gives meaning to the exile. Humanity's story is not one of permanent separation, but of eventual restoration. Another ancient theme appears subtly in the exile narrative, the transition from garden to field. In many Near Eastern texts, gardens represent controlled, cultivated spaces associated with divine or royal presence. Fields, by contrast, represent human effort, toil, and vulnerability to the elements. Adam's shift from garden tending to field labor reflects this symbolic change. It marks the movement from divine provision to human struggle. Yet, even in this new environment, the vocation to cultivate remains. Humanity still participates in shaping the world, though now under altered conditions. The naming of Eve immediately before the exile also carries symbolic meaning. In ancient cultures, naming often occurred at moments of transition. By naming Eve, mother of all living, Adam acknowledges that life continues despite the loss of Eden. This naming also connects humanity's new path to a future beyond exile. Even as sacred presence becomes mediated, human life multiplies, evolves, and seeks meaning in a world shaped by both absence and promise. When Adam and Eve finally exit the garden, the narrative concludes with an image of closure, not finality. The cherubim stand guard, the fiery boundary turns, the way to the tree of life is protected. But the story does not portray God as abandoning humanity. Instead, it depicts a shift in relationship from direct presence to mediated interaction, from sacred proximity to lived expectation. This tension between closeness and distance shapes the biblical story from this point onward. The ancient world viewed exile as both judgment and opportunity. It disrupted identity but created space for transformation. It signaled brokenness but pointed toward hope. In this sense, the exile from Eden becomes the archetype of the human condition. Every form of displacement, every experience of distance from the sacred echoes this moment, and every longing for restoration, whether expressed through covenant, worship, or eschatological hope, reaches back toward the garden. The narrative of Eden's exile does not end with despair. It ends with guarded holiness, preserved life, and the possibility of return. In later prophetic visions, the restoration of Eden becomes the climax of the divine story, a world where humanity once again walks in harmony with God, where rivers flow from the sacred center, where the tree of life yields fruit for healing, and where the barriers erected after the fall are finally lifted. In the next part, the focus shifts from the boundary of Eden to the world beyond, the realm into which humanity enters, the wilderness shaped by chaos and order, and the new challenges that arise as Adam and Eve begin life outside the sacred center. When Adam and Eve take their first steps beyond the boundary guarded by cherubim, the world they enter is not described in detail. Genesis gives no sweeping landscape imagery, no explicit description of terrain or climate, no explanation of what the outer world looked like compared to Eden. Yet, ancient readers would have known exactly what this transition implied. To leave a sacred garden was to enter the wilderness, a realm physically real but symbolically charged, representing disorder, danger, and the unfinished work of creation. In the ancient Near East, wilderness was not merely an uninhabited place. It was a domain where divine order had not yet fully taken root, where humans encountered forces beyond their control. Wilderness signified vulnerability, uncertainty, and exposure. It was where shepherds risked their flocks, where travelers feared bandits, and where kings led armies into lands unclaimed by temples or cities. The wilderness was not the opposite of civilization, but the boundary where civilization met chaos. And in biblical imagery, chaos is never simply absence. It is the lingering remnant of the primordial disorder subdued at creation. The exile from Eden, therefore, represents more than a physical relocation. It marks humanity's entry into a world where divine order must be sought rather than assumed, cultivated rather than inherited. Eden was structured around harmony. The wilderness requires effort, vigilance, and adaptation. The ground that once yielded effortlessly now resists. Harmony with creation must be earned. Life becomes a struggle shaped by conditions that mirror the consequences of disobedience. Ancient Jewish interpreters understood the symbolism of this transition. They saw Eden as the archetype of sacred order and the outer world as the realm where humanity would experience the tension between divine intention and human frailty. This tension would define the human experience, not as punishment, but as a new environment in which wisdom, justice, and relationship would develop under different conditions. The narrative hints at this change through the description of the land's resistance to cultivation. In Eden, Adam's role reflected priestly stewardship. Outside Eden, his role shifts towards survival. This shift mirrors themes found in ancient agricultural societies where the land served as both blessing and obstacle. Fertility was seen as a sign of divine favor, while drought, thorns, and barrenness were interpreted as signs of divine distance or the lingering presence of chaos. Genesis captures this worldview poignantly. The soil that was once Adam's partner becomes his challenge. Yet this struggle is not meaningless. In ancient thought, working the land was not merely labor. It was a form of participation in the ongoing ordering of the world. Every seed planted, every field cleared, every structure built was an attempt to push back the wilderness, to extend the boundaries of ordered existence. Humanity, now separated from Eden, continues the work of creation in a new way, not by tending a perfect garden, but by confronting the unfinished, untamed landscape entrusted to their care. This theme appears throughout Scripture. The patriarchs wander through wilderness regions, encountering both danger and divine encounters. Israel journeys through the wilderness for a generation, learning dependence on God and receiving laws that structure communal life. Prophets retreat into the wilderness to receive revelation. The wilderness becomes a place of testing, formation, and transformation. All of these narratives echo the first transition from Eden to the outer world, the beginning of humanity's long engagement with places of disorder. Beyond the physical landscape, the wilderness also represents the psychological and spiritual condition of humanity after the fall. Adam and Eve enter a world where direct access to divine presence is no longer available. The loss of sacred immediacy forces them to develop new modes of understanding and new relationships with God. In Eden, they encountered God in a state of harmony. Outside Eden, they must seek God through prayer, sacrifice, and mediated presence. This shift marks the beginning of religious consciousness, not merely ritual action, but the existential awareness of distance and longing. The first children born outside Eden emerge into this environment of tension. Cain and Abel inherit a world shaped by both divine memory and wilderness reality. Their offerings to God reflect humanity's new condition. Worship becomes an act of reaching toward the sacred from a position of distance. Their conflict, one brother's offering accepted, another's rejected, reveals the challenges of navigating divine expectation outside Eden's clarity. The murder of Abel further illustrates how the wilderness condition intensifies the human struggle between order and chaos, obedience and rebellion. The world outside Eden is not inherently evil. It is incomplete. It is creation awaiting human participation, shaped by divine intention, yet requiring human cultivation. In this sense, humanity's exile becomes humanity's mission. What was once effortless becomes responsibility. What was once given becomes earned. What was once received becomes sought. This new condition also introduces the concept of mortality into human consciousness. While mortality existed implicitly before the fall, humans were created from dust and dependent on divine life. The exile makes it explicit. Outside Eden, death becomes a visible reality, part of the natural world that humanity must confront. The narrative does not describe Adam and Eve's immediate experience of death, but ancient interpreters imagine the profound shift. Seeing plants wither, animals die, and the fragility of life become evident. This confrontation with mortality shapes the human search for meaning. Ancient societies responded to death through burial rituals, ancestor veneration, and mythic stories explaining the origins of human limitation. In this context, the memory of Eden becomes a powerful symbol, a reminder of a world without death's shadow, a world to which humanity cannot return but longs to see restored. The tree of life, now guarded, becomes the unattainable ideal of immortality, shaping humanity's religious imagination for generations. The wilderness environment also intensifies the presence of danger. In Eden, Adam and Eve encountered no predators, no harsh climates, no natural threats. Outside the garden, they face a world where survival requires awareness, skill, and adaptation. The wilderness hosts wild animals uncontrolled by human authority, weather patterns that threaten crops, and terrain that challenges movement. In ancient literature, wilderness was often portrayed as the dwelling place of demons, outlaws, and forces beyond the reach of civilization. While Genesis does not attribute supernatural entities to the wilderness, the symbolic association would have been understood by ancient audiences. At the same time, the wilderness is also a place where God meets humanity in new ways. It is in the wilderness that Hagar encounters God's messenger. It is in the wilderness that Jacob wrestles with the divine. It is in the wilderness that Moses speaks with God through a burning bush. These encounters reveal that even outside Eden, divine presence is not absent. It is simply differently mediated. The distance created by exile does not eliminate relationship. It transforms it. The expulsion from Eden thus initiates a pattern. Human beings must learn to recognize divine presence in an environment not shaped by sacred architecture, but by open horizons and unpredictable terrain. The wilderness becomes a place of revelation, precisely because it lacks the ordered structure of the garden. Humans, confronted with vulnerability, become open to divine guidance. Another theme that emerges outside Eden is the growth of society. The narrative moves quickly from Adam and Eve to their children, then to Cain's descendants, who build cities, forge instruments, and develop cultural practices. This rapid expansion reflects the ancient understanding that civilization arises in tension with wilderness. Cities were sanctuaries of order, protected from the threats of the wild. By describing city building outside Eden, Genesis suggests that humanity continues to pursue the creation of ordered spaces. Reflections of the lost garden, though shaped by human initiative rather than divine design. Yet these human-made structures also carry the potential for corruption. Cain builds the first city, a detail that ancient interpreters saw as significant. The city emerges not from harmony, but from violence. Its foundation reflects human attempts to create stability through control rather than through alignment with divine order. This marks a critical tension in the post-Eden world. Human creativity is powerful, but without divine guidance, it risks producing structures that mirror human brokenness rather than divine intention. The genealogies that follow reveal both the flourishing and the fracturing of humanity. They describe advancements in agriculture, metalworking, music, and pastoral life, all signs of cultural development. But they also describe increasing violence, boasting, and moral decline. This dual narrative reflects the complexity of human existence outside Eden. The wilderness condition shapes both creativity and corruption, progress and peril. Humanity becomes capable of extraordinary achievements, yet struggles with the internal disorder introduced by the fall. The world into which Adam and Eve move also contains a symbolic tension between order and chaos, represented by land and sea, cultivated fields, and wilderness expanses, human communities, and untamed nature. This tension is not accidental. It reflects the broader biblical theme that creation is an ongoing process, not a completed event. Humans, as bearers of the divine image, are called to participate in shaping the world toward order, justice, and flourishing. But the exile introduces obstacles, internal and external, that complicate this task. In some later Jewish writings, the world outside Eden is described as a place where remnants of primordial chaos still linger. These texts imagine the outer world as less stable, less harmonious, and more prone to disruption. This worldview does not contradict Genesis, but expands upon the implication that Eden was uniquely ordered. Outside its boundaries, creation is functional, but not perfected. Another important symbolic dimension of life outside Eden involves time. In the garden, time is not described. There is no death, no aging, no seasons. Outside Eden, time begins to shape human experience through birth, maturity, decline, and death. This change introduces narrative progression, historical development, and generational continuity. The wilderness, with its cycles of seasons and unpredictability, becomes the environment in which time becomes tangible. Humanity begins to measure life, plan for the future, remember the past, and anticipate what lies ahead. The psychological impact of exile also emerges subtly in the narrative. Adam and Eve must adapt to a world where choices carry uncertain consequences, where survival requires effort, and where relationships endure strain. Their lives become marked by sorrow, as hinted in the pronouncements of Part 7. Yet, even amid sorrow, there is renewal. Eve gives birth. Adam names his sons. The human family grows. Exile becomes the context in which love, lineage, and memory take shape. The first altar in Scripture, though not explicitly described in Genesis, is implied in the offerings of Cain and Abel. This moment marks humanity's attempt to reconnect with the divine through ritual. In Eden, worship was embedded in existence. Outside Eden, worship becomes intentional, an act of reaching across the boundary, separating humanity from the sacred center. The offerings reflect the human recognition that life in the wilderness depends on divine favor as much as on human labor. The wilderness condition also prompts the development of law and ethics. As families grow into communities, boundaries, norms, and expectations become necessary. These structures do not replace divine order, but reflect humanity's attempt to recreate harmony. The seeds of later law codes, including those given at Sinai, originate in the tension and dislocation introduced by exile. Humanity grapples with justice, fairness, and responsibility, not in a perfect world, but in one shaped by imperfection. Even the concept of sacrifice emerges from this condition. Sacrifice becomes a means of restoring balance, expressing gratitude, or seeking reconciliation. In the absence of Eden's direct presence, ritual becomes the intermediary. This development reflects the broader biblical pattern. Distance from the divine prompts new forms of relationship. The wilderness is not merely a place of loss. It is a crucible in which religion, culture, identity, and meaning take shape. One of the most profound aspects of the post-Eden world is that it becomes the stage where divine purpose continues, not ends. Despite exile, humanity remains the bearer of the divine image. Despite distance, God still engages, warns, guides, and promises. The wilderness becomes the world in which human history unfolds, a world filled with both beauty and danger, hope and sorrow, innovation and destruction. The longing for Eden, for the sacred center, for harmony, for life without decay, becomes an undercurrent in all human cultures. Ancient societies created myths, rituals, and sacred spaces to recapture the lost paradise. The Hebrew scriptures channel this longing toward a future restoration. Prophets envision a world where deserts bloom, where knowledge of God fills the earth, where death is no more, where the tree of life reappears. These visions frame human history not as a descent into chaos, but as a journey toward renewed creation. The narrative of life beyond Eden reveals that the exile is not merely a backward glance. It is the beginning of a forward movement. Humanity steps into a world shaped by wilderness, but destined for restoration. The obstacles encountered, mortality, danger, estrangement, toil, become the very context in which divine redemption will act. The wilderness becomes the training ground for covenant, the birthplace of nations, and the arena in which God's purposes unfold. The human condition outside Eden is complex. It is marked by struggle and resilience, by distance and longing, by innovation and brokenness. Yet, through it all, a thread of hope weaves forward, the possibility of return not geographically, but relationally, spiritually, and ultimately cosmically. In the final part of this investigation, we will explore the ancient belief that Eden was not destroyed but hidden, and how the hope of returning to the sacred center shaped early Jewish and Christian expectations about the end of the age. When the final lines of Genesis's Eden narrative close, the garden remains intact. This detail, brief yet intentional, shaped centuries of interpretation. Eden is not destroyed. It is sealed. Its entrance is guarded, its sanctity preserved, its tree of life still, standing somewhere beyond human reach. For ancient readers, this meant one thing. Eden's story was not over. The exile marked a boundary, not an ending. The garden remained part of cosmic geography, hidden, inaccessible, but real. To understand the full weight of this idea, we must revisit how the ancient world conceived sacred spaces. In Near Eastern cosmology, holy places were often shielded from ordinary perception. Divine realms were veiled, mountains concealed by clouds, temples accessible only through ritual purification. Sacred spaces were not destroyed when violated. They were closed. This pattern is precisely what Genesis presents. The garden becomes a protected sanctuary, removed from the rhythms of human life, but preserved as a future possibility. Early Jewish interpreters believed Eden still existed, either on earth or in a hidden dimension of creation, safeguarded until the time when humanity would again be ready to dwell within divine presence. This belief influenced how Israel understood its own history. When the tabernacle was built in the wilderness, its structure echoed Eden's sacred order: cherubim at the entrance, a central sacred object, a defined orientation toward the east, and a sanctuary representing divine presence. The Israelites did not recreate Eden. They built a microcosm of it. The temple in Jerusalem extended this pattern further, functioning as the restored center where heaven and earth briefly met. Every pilgrimage to the temple was, symbolically, a journey toward the lost garden. In this sense, Eden became more than a historical location. It became a model, a blueprint for divine human relationship. The garden represented the ideal order of creation: life flowing from the divine center, boundaries upheld, vocation fulfilled, harmony sustained. Exile fractured this model, but Israel's sacred history consistently attempted to rebuild it. The tabernacle, the temple, the priesthood, the sacrificial system, all were attempts to restore Edenic patterns under new conditions. Ancient Jewish writings developed this idea explicitly. Some texts describe Eden as elevated on a mountain, reflecting the ancient belief that divine presence dwelled on heights. Others portray Eden as one of the preserved cosmic realms guarded until the end of days. Still others imagined Eden split into two dimensions: an earthly paradise inaccessible since the fall, and a heavenly counterpart prepared for the righteous. These interpretations differ in detail, but share a common conviction: Eden's story continues beyond the narrative of Genesis. The hope of return emerges within this framework. It is not the hope of retracing physical steps or discovering a lost location. It is the hope of restored relationship, renewed vocation, and access to divine life. The guarded entrance symbolizes a barrier that remains until humanity is transformed. The cherubim do not merely prevent return. They hold open the possibility once alignment with a divine order is restored. This theme becomes central in prophetic literature. Prophets envision a time when the wilderness blossoms, when rivers flow from restored sanctuaries, when nations gather to encounter divine presence. The imagery often echoes Eden: fertile landscapes, flowing waters, abundant fruit, harmony between creatures, and a renewed relationship between humanity and land. These visions are not nostalgic dreams, but eschatological declarations. The belief that history is moving toward restoration rather than decay. One of the most striking examples appears in the visions attributed to Ezekiel. He describes a future temple from which a river flows eastward, deepening as it moves and healing the land it touches. On its banks grow trees bearing fruit every month, whose leaves bring healing. This imagery unmistakably parallels the tree of life and Eden's central river. The restored temple becomes a new Eden, where divine presence once again sustains creation. Ezekiel's vision is not metaphorical. It is cosmic. It reimagines Eden as the ultimate future, not the lost past. Ancient Jews saw in these visions not a return to primal simplicity, but the culmination of creation's purpose. Eden was the model, but the future restoration would be greater. A world where divine presence filled the earth, where mortality was overcome, where justice prevailed, and where the boundaries broken in Eden were finally healed. In this worldview, history moves from sacred harmony to fragmentation and back to harmony on a grander scale. The hope of return also shaped early Christian thought. They too saw Eden not as an unreachable past, but as a symbol of restored creation. The imagery of paradise appears repeatedly in their writings, a realm of life, healing, and communion with God. They drew upon Second Temple era Jewish interpretations that envisioned Eden as a heavenly realm into which the righteous would enter after death or at the end of the age. The tree of life reappears in these texts, bearing fruit in restored creation, sustaining life as it once did in the garden. These interpretations did not invent new symbols. They inherited them from the ancient understanding of Eden as a preserved sanctuary. The guarded entrance became less a barrier and more a promise. Divine life remained, protected until humanity could receive it without distortion. The exile, therefore, was not permanent separation, but preparation for restoration. Another dimension of this hope concerns geographical transformation. Some ancient traditions held that Eden would become visible again when the world was renewed. This belief was tied to the idea of cosmic unveiling, the removal of boundaries between divine and human realms at the end of days. The hidden garden, preserved since the fall, would be revealed not by human discovery, but by divine action. This unveiling would restore access to the tree of life, fulfilling the promise that divine presence would once again sustain humanity. The presence of the tree of life in later visions underscores its enduring significance. In Genesis, access to the tree is restricted because humanity cannot partake of divine life while living in rebellion. In later visions, access is restored because humanity is transformed. The guarded way becomes open because the human condition has changed. The tree stands as the symbol of healing, unity, and restored relationship. The very things lost in Eden. The ancient belief in Eden's hiddenness also shaped ethical and spiritual life. If Eden represented ideal order, then living in harmony with divine instruction became a way of aligning oneself with that order even outside the garden. Observing commandments, pursuing justice, cultivating mercy, these actions were seen as glimpses of Eden restored within human life. Wisdom literature explicitly uses Edenic imagery to describe righteous living. The righteous are likened to trees planted by streams of water, bearing fruit in season. Righteousness becomes a foretaste of restored creation. This ethical dimension reveals another key theme. The return to Eden is not merely geographical or eschatological. It is moral and relational. Restoration begins in the human heart. The divine presence that once walked freely in the garden becomes accessible through alignment with divine character. Eden becomes not only a future hope, but a pattern for how humans ought to live in the present. Yet the narrative is honest about the challenges. Human violence, corruption, and pride complicate the journey. The world outside Eden, shaped by the consequences of the fall, contains forces that oppose divine order. These forces are symbolized in early narratives by figures like Cain, Lamech, and the generation before the flood. Their stories reflect the amplification of disorder and the widening gap between human life and Edenic harmony. Despite these challenges, the hope of return persists. The genealogies in Genesis include moments of faithfulness. Individuals who walked with God, found favor, or pursued righteousness. These examples serve as reminders that exile does not eliminate the possibility of alignment with divine presence. Even in a fractured world, seeds of Edenic life take root. A key development occurs in the story of Abraham. His call represents a new phase in humanity's relationship with God, the beginning of a covenant that will shape nations, create sacred identity, and prepare the way for restoration. Abraham's journey begins with a departure, leaving homeland and security, and leads to the promise of a land, a people, and a future shaped by divine blessing. This promise links to the Eden narrative, indirectly but profoundly. Abraham becomes the ancestor of a people tasked with embodying divine order in the world, living in ways that reflect the sacred harmony lost in Eden. The land promised to Abraham becomes a prototype of restored, sacred space. It is not Eden, but it functions symbolically as territory where divine favor dwells. Israel's law, worship, and covenantal life are shaped to reflect Edenic patterns, not perfectly, but intentionally. The presence of God among his people, first in the tabernacle and later in the temple, represents partial restoration of Eden's intimacy. Israel's history is, in many ways, the story of attempting to recover harmony within a world still marked by exile. When that harmony is disrupted through injustice, idolatry, and disobedience, Israel experiences its own exile, a national reflection of humanity's primordial exile. Yet, even this exile carries hope. Prophets speak of a return not only to land but to restored relationship. Their visions often include Edenic imagery, abundant harvests, flowing water, fertile landscapes, harmony between humans and animals. Through these visions, the Eden story becomes the foundation for understanding historical restoration. In later Jewish apocalyptic literature, Eden becomes the destination of the righteous in the world to come. It is depicted as a place of light, life, and divine presence. The garden is elevated, transcendent, located in the highest realm of creation. Its rivers flow with purity. Its fruit sustains eternal life. Its boundaries are open only to those who have aligned themselves with divine wisdom. This interpretation does not contradict Genesis, but expands upon the belief that Eden remains preserved. The theme of Eden's hiddenness also shapes early Christian eschatology. In their writings, the restored world at the end of the age includes a river flowing from the throne of God and the tree of life, bearing fruit for the healing of nations. This imagery mirrors both Genesis and Ezekiel, merging the beginning and end of the biblical story into a unified vision of restored creation. For them, the return to Eden symbolizes the culmination of divine purpose, not a return to simplicity, but the fulfillment of humanity's intended destiny. One of the most profound aspects of the final restoration is the transformation of sacred geography. The hope is not merely for humanity to enter a garden, but for creation itself to become a garden. Harmony, once localized in Eden, expands to fill the earth. The sacred center becomes universal. Divine presence saturates creation. The tree of life, once guarded, becomes accessible in abundance. This conclusion reveals the narrative's overarching arc. Eden is the prototype, exile is the condition, covenant is the path, and restoration is the destination. The guarded boundary that closes Genesis 3 is not the final word. It is a threshold awaiting cosmic renewal. The ancient belief that Eden is hidden, not lost, carries a message that shaped millennia of faith. What was broken will be healed. What was closed will be opened. What was guarded will one day be accessible again. The divine order disrupted in Eden will be restored on a scale far greater than the first garden ever contained. The Eden narrative, from beginning to end, is a story of presence, boundary, exile, and return. It presents humanity with the tension between divine order and human autonomy, between sacred harmony and fractured existence. But it also presents the enduring truth that divine purpose moves history toward restoration. The exile is real, the distance profound, but the hope of return remains at the heart of the biblical vision. Eden stands preserved behind its boundary, waiting for the world to be made whole.